Hi. So for today we're going to do a little demonstration of analog to digital encoding in the nervous system. And so in order to look at that, we're going to first look at the conversion of force necessary to be applied to an object, or the amount of muscle contraction you have to apply in order to lift objects of different weights, which is your analog information. The effector muscles must produce a varying amount of force to lift objects that weigh different weights, and those could be any weights among a very broad spectrum of human capabilities for lifting. And in order to get at that specific amount of force that needs to be applied, there's a digital code that occurs in the muscle contraction, in the muscle cells themselves, in the form of ones or zeros, or action potentials or no action potentials. And so the action potential digital code is essentially a rate code that encodes the amount of force that needs to be applied to lift objects of different weights. So we're going to take a look at what that looks like using this clinical neurophysiology equipment. And I have electrodes hooked up to my pollicis longus muscle in my arm so that we can actually see what the action potentials, or these are going to be compound muscle action potentials, what they look like while I'm flexing my arm in response to generate different amounts of force necessary to lift different objects. So here we go. So right now my arm is relatively at rest, and so as you can see in the baseline EMG recordings, there are very few action potentials, and since these are compound muscle action potentials, the amplitudes are very low since my arm is at rest. Here I'll turn on the volume so you should be able to actually hear the action potentials as well. There will be a little bit of background noise, but generally the recordings are very quiet, both in amplitude as well as in sound. So as I begin to lift up my hand and use my pollicis longus muscle to generate a small amount of force just necessary to lift my hand, now you can see that the analog stimulus, the analog amount of force necessary to lift my hand, gets converted into a specific rate pattern of action potentials in the muscle necessary to lift my hand. And so you can see that those compound muscle action potentials are of varying amplitude and have a pretty specific firing rate. Now what happens if I want to lift an object that's slightly heavier than my hand? Let's say, for example, this coffee cup, which I drink a lot of coffee, so I probably exercise this muscle a lot. Now, as I go to drink my coffee, I'm not sure if I'm actually flexing that muscle. There we go. Okay. So it's baseline, basically. I drink my coffee, and there's also a bit of a firing pattern as I'm putting the cup down, because that also requires some extension that's also being picked up in the EMG. So there you can see that there's a slightly different firing rate when I'm picking up the coffee mug as opposed to when I just need to lift my hand. Certainly I don't need to put any force on extension when I'm just resting my hand down either. So it's completely quiet while I'm extending my hand. So now I'm going to try lifting something just a little bit heavier. So something that probably you all have experienced lifting. You recognize this. This is Candel's textbook. And it requires a lot of force to lift it because it's a very heavy textbook. So let's see what happens when I try to lift up Eric Candel's Principles of Neuroscience textbook while recording action potentials from that muscle, the pollicis longus. Okay, it's very, very heavy. You can barely lift it with one hand, so there we go. Look at those action action potentials. That is a heavy book, and that is an intense amount of force, as well as a very high firing rate with large amplitude compound muscle action potentials. Okay, so now we're going to look at sense of touch and the various different types of fibers that are both either slowly adapting or rapidly adapting, and of course there are several different touch receptors in my hand as well. So now we're going to try to elicit action potentials from either the slowly adapting or the rapidly adapting receptors and see how they compare in terms of the recordings and action potentials from my median nerve, or hopefully at least very close to my median nerve, from the receptors that are in the palm and fingers of my hand. So now, as I take my finger and gently touch my hand and put a slight amount of pressure, now you can see a couple little bursts of action potentials. That was a little bit longer train. I'm sort of touching my hand and trying to keep the pressure the same after I've touched my hand. So we get a slight action potential burst, and then sometimes it rapidly becomes silent again. So that would be an example of rapidly adapting touch receptor fibers. And so you can tell me what types of touch receptors I'm likely activating if they're rapidly adapting with a slight amount of pressure. So now I'm going to put a little bit more pressure in the palm of my hand near the crevices and see if I can activate the slowly adapting touch receptor fibers. So now you see I'm applying constant pressure in the crevices of the palm of my hand. I can very readily activate fibers that tend to remain active for a prolonged period of time. Right, once I take my finger off, the firing pattern goes away. So again, these are probably slowly adapting touch receptor afferents. So now we're going to look at direction selectivity in the sensory afferents of the palm of my hand. So I'm going to use my finger and swipe either distally to proximally or proximally to distally using the same amount of pressure, crossing the same receptive fields, and see if we can come up with the same or a different firing pattern. So I'll start with distal to proximal using the same amount of pressure now. This is swipe down, swipe down, swipe down, swipe down. Now let's use the same amount of pressure swiping in the opposite direction from proximal to distal, including the same receptive fields. So it would seem that the receptors in this area of the palm of my hand, for whatever reason, seem to be more sensitive to the opposite direction, the proximal to distal swipe, as I can record from the action potentials near my median nerve where my electrodes are placed. So now we've seen demonstrations of the analog to digital conversion using the muscle system and how it converts firing patterns into force to lift objects. We've also seen a couple of different touch receptors and examples of their slowly and rapidly adapting afferents, as well as a little bit of direction selectivity in the palm of my hand. So I hope you enjoyed this demonstration, and I'll see you in class.